today we have an incredible human here with us. We have Paul Taylor. He is the Executive Director of Food Share Toronto and a lifelong anti-poverty activist. Growing up materially poor in Toronto, Paul has used his experience to fuel a career focused not just helping others, but dismantling the beliefs and systems that lead to poverty and food insecurity, including colonialism, capitalism, white supremacy, and patriarchal structures. So today, Paul is going to be speaking with us about understanding the intersections of social justice issues with agency programming and activities. We know that those are vital to strengthening our capacity to collaborate meaningfully and effectively with communities around anti-oppression work. Paul will be sharing his social justice approach to service delivery work with a particular focus on food insecurity. So please give Paul a round of applause, give him some love, show some of those reactions that you've got going on. Amazing. Welcome, Paul. We're so excited to have you.
I'm honored to be here. Thank you so much.
Of course. So we're going to begin. I want to make sure that you have as much time as possible to impart your wisdom and knowledge on us. But before we jump into it, I do have a few questions for you.
Sure,
Is that okay?
Absolutely.
Amazing. So when we first started the retreat, I had the opportunity to do a little bit of a grounding and visualization activity with folks. And the question that I've been asking any of our guests that have come is, where do you feel the most rooted or the most grounded? What is that place for you, if you're comfortable sharing that with us?
Oh, that is such a good question. And it's a relatively easy answer for me because there are, it's often this, there's two things that kind of jump out at me. It's the spaces where I go when I'm reflecting on the day or thinking about the day ahead. So I love, for folks in Toronto, I love the West Toronto Rail Path. In the West End. I walk it pretty frequently, almost every day. And also when I'm on my bicycle, I love cycling. Growing up as a materially poor kid, when I discovered that I could ride a bicycle and get to where I needed to be without having to pay for transit, I was elated. So I spent many, many years pretty much glued to my bicycle.
That's amazing. I love that. I also am a bike rider, and it's that sense of freedom, right? You're able to kind of get wherever you need to. I was really scared riding a bike in Toronto for the first time, but I think I've mastered it now.
Nice.
So thank you so much for sharing that with us. The second question that I have for you is, as for myself, as a queer Indigenous woman, I know that I was born with activism and resilience in my blood. Knowing that you've been involved in anti-poverty work for a very long time, at what age did you know that you wanted to become an anti-poverty activist? Or what was the moment for you that it clicked that this work was calling you?
Okay, I hope I don't give it away. I'm going to be maybe talking about this. I'm going to be talking about a whole bunch of things, rambling off. But for me, I was 13 years old. I'll never forget it. It was the day former Premier Mike Harris decided that he was going to cut welfare by about 22%. I was on welfare. My family was on welfare. That meant about 22% less food. That meant a whole host of things. But what it did for me is really invited me into how the systems that were affecting the life of my family was really tied to political decisions in lots of ways. So that's what set me on that path, I would say.
That's incredible. Thank you for that. The other thing that I just wanted to mention, and I don't know if you're going to talk about this or not, but with Food Share, I was really excited when I first heard about Food Share and the good food boxes that you folks have, specifically the dismantling white supremacy box is incredible. So I do hope that you talk about that at some point and kind of the impacts of that within the community, because that's something that I know myself and a lot of my friends and other BIPOC folks were so excited to see and excited to take part in. So that's awesome. I'm just gonna pass it over to you now, and I'd love for you to share just some of your thoughts and some of the wisdom that you're bringing today to us.
For sure. Thank you, Talitha. And if I don't get to the dismantling white supremacy box, please remind me.
I will, for sure.
I will definitely speak to it. So thank you for the invitation. Thank you, everybody, for joining today. I'm really grateful for this invitation and super thankful to the Toronto Neighborhood Centres for arranging to have me here today. I spent, what you may or may not know is that I spent several years actually working at place-based neighborhood organizations. I spent 6 years living in Vancouver. And while I was living in Vancouver, I was the executive director of the neighborhood house in the downtown east side of Vancouver. And then the executive director at Gordon Neighborhood House in Vancouver's West End. So neighborhood houses and neighborhood centers, place-based community organizations are near and dear to my heart. And I think they can play such an important role in kind of rethinking and asserting a different conversation about collaboration with community. And I'm going to talk about that in a little bit. Before I do that, though, I want to dedicate my remarks today to someone that I'm going to also talk about a little bit later. But so that you know her name, and you may be familiar with her name is Regis Porchinsky-Paquette, and she lived in my community until her death. And while she may be gone, she's inspired a burning desire for justice in many of us. So may she rest in power. And, I truly believe that we can't and we won't let her down in pursuit of justice for Regis. Food Share, the organization that I currently work for, is focused on challenging food insecurity and poverty in a few ways. And maybe I'll start there. So our work is really focused on working with communities across the city to build resident-led community food infrastructure. So it's challenging. We talk about challenging capitalism. It's about creating community-led, community-owned alternatives for something to support people's access to food. So we're talking about things like subsidized produce markets, urban farms, and urban farms that allow folks to be able to grow and sell the food that they grow. And also community-driven school food programs and a variety of initiatives ultimately aimed at increasing access to fresh produce for those that are systematically interacting with barriers to access to fresh produce. We do a bunch of things, though. We also sell bulk produce to community organizations across the city in an attempt to help lower food costs and provide increased access to fresh produce to as many as we can. So in essence, we model alternative ways of accessing fresh produce that doesn't depend on the profit model, which, as you know, is at the heart of capitalism. Through the commodification of food, we've actually made it something for businesses to be able to make a profit off of, which makes food out of reach for many and does nothing to help protect our fundamental human right to food. So charity, as we know, and community-based food interventions will not solve poverty, nor will they solve food insecurity. Food insecurity, this is kind of the way we're understanding this issue, is food insecurity and poverty are issues that are absolutely rooted largely in inadequate incomes. So in addition to the work that we do to help build community-led food infrastructure, we're also engaged in ongoing advocacy work around the things that cause people to be food insecure. So through our advocacy efforts, we work to also draw attention to the fact that in Canada, we have ratified this thing called the right to food, which means everyone should have access. It's the responsibility of our government to create the conditions to allow people to access the food that they need. Our advocacy, as was mentioned earlier, also includes challenging oppressive systems like capitalism, colonialism, patriarchy, racism, anti-Black racism, anti-indigeneity, that all work to both cause and perpetuate issues like poverty and food insecurity. So although we're doing food activities, we also highlight the huge potential of income-based interventions, like things like living wage or a guaranteed income or an income floor to address issues of food insecurity and poverty. Like you, each day I realize more and more that I think we're at a critical point, and we can't let ourselves be convinced that the existence of poverty and food insecurity, things that we see and interact with every day, whether it's that we've gone through or the folks that we work with are going through, or folks in our community, these things are not inevitable. One of the most important things that I think we can do in our work includes recognizing that it's our systems and institutions that have failed folks in our communities. Often I see, organizations have this idea that the folks in the community, there's something wrong with them, and it's up to the organization to fix what's wrong with those folks. But when we're talking about things like material poverty and food insecurity, by no, it's unequivocally, it's that our systems and institutions have failed folks. So recognizing that helps Food Share, my colleagues and I, look a bit more upstream, and it creates the basis for collaborating with community to advance the type of change that we know is long overdue. And let's be real, we live in one of the richest countries on the planet. Everyone living on Turtle Island should be able to access food to eat and a place to sleep. No ifs, ands, or buts. We know, and of course, we're in the context of a pandemic. So we know that food insecurity and poverty are undoubtedly being further exacerbated by the pandemic. Prior to the pandemic, reports suggested there were about 4.4 million Canadians that were food insecure. The most recent numbers in the middle of the pandemic suggest that that has skyrocketed to 5.5 million people. So that is like combining the populations of Toronto, Montreal, and Winnipeg. Huge crisis in this country. We're seeing through the pandemic as well, significant fault lines being exposed and inequities in the way that we each experience the pandemic. One of the things as I talk to more and more folks, I'm learning that the way we experience this pandemic is largely divided along race and class lines. And I talked about my walks in the mornings. And when I go on my walks, I talk to everybody about these walks because that's when I take in so much of the world based on what I'm seeing in my community. And when I go on these walks, I see the bus go by, I see the streetcar go by. And I remember at the beginning of the pandemic thinking, oh my goodness, who is having to take the streetcar or the bus right now? Who's having to say goodbye to their kids? While their kids know that it's dangerous to be, outside in public spaces. So what I've realized when I look into those buses is I see that they are disproportionately Black and brown women. Black and brown women that have low income jobs that we've deemed essential. And these are folks that are going into work in jobs that don't provide enough paid sick days, which means when folks are getting sick, they're still having to go to work or they're hiding the fact that they're sick. And also there's often not enough PPE at those workplaces. So of course, as a result, we're going to see the highest concentration of COVID-19 cases in communities with higher Black, Indigenous, and POC folk. And I think it's also coupled with the chronic underinvestment in communities that are disproportionately Black and BIPOC. So I think evoking the type of fundamental shift that we need, yes, it's going to be difficult, but I believe the way to do it is we need everyone working to do what they can to change things in the places that they are. So a little bit more about me. I mentioned that I grew up materially poor, and like most who were poor on welfare, we struggled a lot for large portions of my childhood. We were without heat, without hot water, electricity, and sometimes food. Now, I'm not hungry or poor anymore, but I certainly remain focused on the systems that foisted poverty, hunger, and shame on my family and far too many others. What happened to me and my family wasn't unique. Like I said earlier, it was largely due to a political decision made by former Premier of Ontario. I was 13. And that had a profound effect. When they cut welfare by 22%, there were people across this province, not just my family, that suffered significantly. These were folks that I'm sure as a result ate much less, and I'm sure some didn't make it. For me, this whole experience of watching this government come to power in Ontario and make these sorts of decisions, was pretty profound. And one thing that I didn't mention earlier that has stuck with me is that was the first time I saw my mother cry. The first time I saw my mother cry was when Mike Harris made this decision that put her under so much more stress. So and part of the reason I bring that up is you may not see the children in your programs go home and cry because they don't have enough food, or because they're worried about their family's survival, or they're tired of the shame, the hiding, or the isolation that seems to be ubiquitous when you're materially poor. But the fact remains that their families right now that are struggling, much like I did as a child, if not worse. And I'm convinced much worse. Band-aids aren't sufficient, and we can't present. One of the things I often talk to other organizations about is how important it is that we not present the work that we do as solutions to the major issues that folks that we work with are navigating. Sure, our work is really important. It's helpful. It's having a significant impact. But when we're talking about food insecurity and poverty, when we position our work as solutions to those things, we allow other people to put their hands up and say, well, they're taking care of that. And this is one of the things that's really bothered me over the years. You know, food banks, especially claiming to end hunger in our communities, I think are actually doing a disservice to the folks that depend on them. The food banks might get more donations or more volunteers, but is that fundamentally really what we're after? To get more donations and more volunteers? I find that that's the important question to ask ourselves. Why do we do what we do? And to keep that front and center in our mind. Is our job to buffer the harms caused by capitalism and other extractive systems? Or do we have an opportunity to push for a more just and equitable society alongside those that we work with? By now, you likely see what I think is the answer to that question, but I believe that, you know, to truly collaborate with the communities that we work with means organizations need to be willing to ask difficult questions, but even more importantly, everyone says ask difficult questions, but more importantly, sit with the answers. It means a willingness to get to the heart of the issues that we're trying to work on so that we can better respond to the circumstances folks are dealing with. Our work simply can't be about building bigger organizations or securing grants and funding to grow our budgets for the sake of big budgets. It's about using our resources to truly help people now while also growing our capacity to collectively advocate for better. For example, you know, there were folks at FoodShare that alongside myself, that were willing to ask, why is there a disproportionate number of Black people engaged in our projects and initiatives? What's going on? You know, I remember when I first started at FoodShare, I went on tours and I saw, you know, the folks accessing our good food markets, the folks working in community to build farms, often a lot of Black folks. So that kind of curiosity and willingness to ask difficult questions led us to partner with Proof, a food insecurity research group out of the University of Toronto. And really what we wanted to do was explore those interconnections between food insecurity and race. We didn't have funding to do this, but felt that it was important information for us to be able we needed this information if we were going to advocate effectively. We had no idea where the research would take us, but we learned more than many of us imagined. In fact, much of what we learned has changed our collective understanding of food insecurity in this country, because we've taken the time to sit with those the answers to those difficult questions, and then are sharing it with as many people as possible, like yourselves. So you can see what starts to unfold when you ask these sorts of difficult questions about the work that we do. Here's what we learned about food insecurity. We started the project saying it was looking at the interconnections of food insecurity and race. And we quickly learned that it was actually something else we were looking at. We were looking at the interconnections of food insecurity and anti-Black racism. Here's what I mean. So a couple of things we learned right off the hop we engaged a researcher, and this was the first thing that we found, and it was that if you're Black in this country, you're 3.5 times more likely to live in a food insecure household than if you're white. 12% of white children live in food insecure households versus 36% of Black children. So of course, our next questions were, what's happening? You know, well, what is going on? What are the things that are causing this to happen? So we looked at everything, you know, and we looked at the things that we understood about food insecurity in this country. Many folks, I'm sure many of you have been involved in advocating for the collection of race-based data. You know, what we found was that when we look at food insecurity statistics aggregately, it tells a very different story than when we look at what the experience is for Black folks in this country. So we looked at things like household composition, because we know that the statistics suggest that if someone lives in a single parent household, they're more likely to be food insecure. Not true for Black Canadians. It doesn't matter if it's a single or dual parent household, the prevalence remained high. Immigration status, the same thing. It didn't matter whether a Black person was born in Canada or born abroad. the risk remained high. It didn't matter how long they've been in the country, simply by being Black, more likely to be food insecure. We looked at home ownership because we know in this country that typically when someone owns a home, they're less likely to be food insecure. Well, what we found was really startling. When it comes to home ownership, 14.3% of white renters, okay, so these are folks who are renting, white folks that are renting their homes, are food insecure, compared to 14.5% of Black homeowners that are food insecure. So in essence, the percentage of Black homeowners that are food insecure is just about equal to the percentage of white renters that are food insecure in this country, suggesting that home ownership didn't serve as a protection for Black folks as it does for white folks. A couple other things I want to note from that research. We looked at social assistance. And we noticed a really strange variance. We saw that white folks in this country actually received more on social assistance than Black folks do. Didn't understand why until we realized that the social assistance figures that we were looking at included disability income supports, which led us to believe that white folks in Canada are more likely to be approved for disability. And when they are approved for disability, they're more likely to be approved for more money than Black folks. One last thing I'll share about this research, and it has to do with seniors. You know, one of the things that folks working in food have begun to advocate for is a basic income, and have argued, myself as well, have argued that we actually don't need another basic income pilot. We don't necessarily need to, restart the last one, because we actually have a basic income in this country. Once someone hits retirement age and can access things like the guaranteed income supplement and old age security and the retirement income, that's actually when we see food insecurity decrease pretty significantly. Again, that's aggregately. When we look at Black Canadians, that becoming a senior, again, doesn't provide the same protection. So what we realize is that this is really down to anti-Black racism. So to truly tackle issues of food insecurity, we realize that we have to collectively acknowledge that systems of oppression, like the ones that I've talked about that we've been working on, have more impact on who gets to eat than how many leftover tins of cranberry sauce we give to a food bank. It goes much beyond food. You know, these oppressive systems that are deeply embedded in society affect where we live, who gets to work, as well as who gets to lead our attempts at finding solutions. These are the types of inequities that we need to understand and integrate into our work, both inside the organization and externally. So for the last decade or more, I've worked as an executive director. And when I look around at leadership in our sector, it looks very much like leadership in corporate Canada. It's pretty white, it's awfully male, and I'm going to go out on a limb and assume that we're talking about cisgendered, hetero white men in leadership. At FoodShare, we've really spent the last few years working to place equity at the forefront of our work. We've got lots to do, but we're committed to aiming really high. Much of the work that we've done in this area has come also without specific funding, but it's work that's important to us, especially if we're going to be intentional about not creating and holding on to the systems that reinforce the inequities that we're also working to challenge. So here are some of the ways that we've applied our values to the way that we work, not just the work itself. We made a really intentional decision not to advance the impact of our work on the backs of our lowest wage colleagues. So we talk a lot about challenging income inequality. I think many of our organizations recognize the role that income inequality is having on who has food and who has housing and the like. So what we did to challenge income inequality within our own walls is we rolled out a new pay grid that gave folks at the bottom of the pay grid, the lowest pay band, a 25% increase and no increase for the senior leadership team. Now, that sounds like, this is about money. What does this have to do with race? Well, in the food system, it's Black and brown folks that are disproportionately reflected in low wage positions. And I think in community organizations connected to food, that isn't any different. So not only did we roll out that new pay grid, but we also introduced a ratio of lowest paid to highest paid. So we introduced a ratio that says the highest paid person in our organization can make no more than 3.7 times what the lowest paid worker makes. any of us who's been in ED knows that many of these conversations around ED compensation happen in closed boardrooms with ED and board, or ED and executive or board says, ED, you've done great work, we should give you a raise, but there's no conversation about all the other people involved in that great work. So what we're saying, and there'll come one day where I'm not at food share, hopefully not too soon, but one day when I'm not at food share, and part of advancing that work is really cementing it and putting that ratio into our DNA, so that it doesn't matter who's in leadership, it doesn't matter who's there, but that it's enshrined in how we do our work, and recognizing that truly we are all in this together. So a couple other things that we've done. We are also asking people to leave their homes. But I should say that before we did that, we also reminded people of their right to refuse unsafe work and sent them all the legislation around that. But we did one other thing. When we're asking people to leave their homes to deliver good food boxes or emergency good food boxes to folks, we recognize that they're taking additional risk. So what we did is we introduced a $4 an hour increase in pay for our essential workers in response to the pandemic. And we have not removed that because the risk remains high. And it's about doing work in a way that we can all be proud. And we know that our colleagues are taking additional risk who are having to leave their homes. So we're compensating them for that. We also, a key thing that I think is really important that we don't do, and it often takes people aback a little bit, is we don't negotiate salaries as part of our hiring process. And that's because we believe that you don't get paid more just because society has been designed for you. You don't get paid more because your work is more likely to be seen. Instead, we've committed to equal pay for equal work. We also have a non-interest emergency loan of up to $2,000 that we make available to our colleagues as they need it. Often it's to assist with first and last month's rent. They decide how much they need and how long it'll take them to pay it back and all of those things. And we've never had someone default or not pay those loans back. And with an organization with a budget our size, even if someone didn't pay it back, that up to $2,000 is a very small amount, but has a huge impact in someone's life if they're trying to flee domestic violence, if they are in an emergency situation where they need first and last. That's huge. And really people will say, we will pay you, we can pay $5 a paycheck for the next however long. And we say that's no problem. We're also mindful of our buying power, and I promised I would talk about this. We're mindful of our buying power. So each year we purchase over 2 million pounds of produce for our various initiatives. Some of you might be familiar with the Good Food Box, but if you aren't, I encourage you, Google it and bookmark it now. It's a great way to get fresh produce delivered to your home while also supporting our work. But one of the things I get the Good Food Box, one of the things I love about it is we are trying to make available the most beautiful, freshest produce. So it's grade A produce. It's not bump and dent produce. And it's often not the produce that you see at the grocery store that's been sitting on grocery store shelves. So it's been really special for us when, and the folks who order the Good Food Box range in all kinds of incomes. But as part of our emergency Good Food Box initiative, having people receive a box delivered to their home during the pandemic filled with produce. So many of our drivers would come back and say, there were 10 people that cried today as I delivered the produce. And it really, really makes a big difference when we challenge some of the kind of two-tiered food system, where many of us are talking about beautiful local organic produce, but if you're materially poor, what society deems that you are deserving of is other people's leftovers and corporate waste. So it was so special to hear those stories of people feeling really touched by what they were receiving. So for this growing season, as Talitha mentioned, we introduced our new Dismantling White Supremacy Good Food Box. So it's a large box of fresh produce that was grown by local BIPOC growers. Gets delivered right to someone's home. And it's just been really special to be able to be thoughtful around. It's not just the work that we do with the people that we do it, but it's about how we live our values and how we seize opportunities throughout everything we do to live our values. So like I said, we buy a lot of produce. Why aren't we putting those dollars in the pockets of the same farmers, the same growers that struggle with access to capital, that struggle with access to credit when it comes to expanding their farms, especially in this country when often we think about farms, we think about old MacDonald and his straw hat and his dog. Well, I can tell you there are so many more farmers and farmers of color that are growing beautiful produce that I would encourage you to support. And, I'm going to talk a little bit about our emergency good food box, because like many of our organizations, the pandemic inspired new initiatives or new ways of doing things. So we created a program that was modeled off the good food box, where we essentially delivered, I think it's just under 1 million pounds of produce to families across the city via a free emergency good food box. And it's identical to the ones that we offer on our Good Food Box website that people can order. And a lot of folks thought, we got a lot of calls when we started doing this. People saying, oh, I've got this many bushels of cucumbers. Can we stuff them into the good food box? And we thought, no, because we're buying our food and we're not using our volunteer hours or volunteer labor or anybody's labor to sort through donated food. Really, we want to make sure that we're buying fresh food. And if there's something wrong with that food, we can hold who we're buying it from accountable. And that's really important to us and really important to anybody eating, I would think. So to do that work around the emergency good food box, and to get 1 million pounds of produce out to folks for free, we partnered with 80 groups across the city. And again, primarily those serving BIPOC folks and also groups with a limited capacity to fundraise. Why did we do that? Because we look at the data and we see that BIPOC folks are more reflected in food insecurity and poverty stats. So we want to make sure the work that we're doing, our interventions, is really getting to the folks that we know that are experiencing the issue the hardest. We went from delivering 200 to 300 boxes a week to 6,000 good food boxes a week. To do this, we had to rent additional cargo vans. We hired over 50 new colleagues to assist us in this, which was really great to be able to provide employment at a time when, and with the $4 top up, when people were struggling. And again, it's about thinking, how do we use our resources to have the maximum impact? So what we did is it was at a time when international students actually, although they're continuing to speak about this and this continues to be an issue, but for international students, we're speaking out about the lack of support made available to them by the government. These are folks who their schools were closing, flights home weren't possible, and work was near impossible. So folks were struggling. So we made an intentional decision to do specific outreach to international students in an attempt to hire as many of them as possible. And again, there's no funding for this. There's no nice report that someone looks at that says, oh, that's so great. Your organization is doing such great work. It just has, for us, had to be about the way we do the work. And in the midst of that work, we were involved around the emergency good food box as a result of the pandemic. We got word that Foodora, you might be familiar with Foodora, the food delivery company that abruptly left Canada in the middle of the pandemic and left workers across the country, low-wage food system workers across the country in a lurch. There are 500 of those workers that were based in Toronto. And the crushing part about this was these were folks that we recognized as essential just a week prior, who were taking risks so that many of us didn't have to go out and buy food. And all of a sudden they were being left stranded and without work by a company that was boasting record profits. We know this, make no mistake about this. This is how capitalism treats low-wage workers, as dispensable. Right when Foodora workers were seeing some significant progress in building a movement around organizing workers in the gig economy, off goes Foodora. So the group that was really working, we partnered with the group that was working to organize these workers called Foodsters United. And what we said to them is, hey, we're going to provide each of the 500 laid off Fedora workers, former Fedora workers, with 3 good food boxes that they could order as needed. And you know what? We're going to deliver it to you. So we have been delivering to these Fedora workers who have been delivering for us. And for us, it was a no-brainer to show up for these low-wage food system workers that had spent weeks helping get food to families. Now we were helping to get food to them in their time of need. And that relationship, with Foodsters United has grown in the most beautiful of ways. We now hire them directly, paying a living wage when we do, so not per delivery or anything like that, as they help us deliver everything from, we launched an initiative where we delivered free balcony farm kits in tower communities. And we also, at the height of the pandemic, as a little pick-me-up to our colleagues, we delivered, Foodsters United delivered on our behalf, baked treats for the food share team after the first few months of this. And that relationship wouldn't have been possible if we allowed ourselves to be locked in the service delivery frame. This is our work is about social justice action and continues to be a major part of how we do our work. The pandemic, while it's exposed the ubiquity of anti-Black racism to folks who never had to think about it, this also highlighted for us almost every night on the news, with regular instances of Black and Indigenous people being killed by the police in this country. And I will never forget that this hit particularly close to home on the night of May 27th, when in my community, an Indigenous Black woman named Regis Porchinsky-Paquette fell to her death from her balcony after an interaction with the police. It marked a really important turning point, I think, in the city and in this conversation. People in the city were just confronted with the reality of the loss of life for Black and Indigenous people as a result of interactions with the police. From that, a new group emerged, Not Another Black Life. Several new groups emerged, but Not Another Black Life were the folks who organized the first large gathering during the pandemic. It was a march called Justice for Regis March. I was there. Food Share's board chair was there, and awesome, my dear now friend Crystal Sinclair, who's an awesome Indigenous activist and the founder of Idle No More Toronto. And just looking over and seeing her there and seeing so many of my Food Share colleagues there, unplanned, I thought, oh my goodness, do I ever work in the right place? But after the march, the Not Another Black Life organizers advised those who showed up at the rally to isolate for 2 weeks. So Food Share then reached out with the folks at Not Another Black Life to provide and said, we're going to provide any attendees that need to self-isolate, that are worried about food, an emergency good food box for each of the 2 weeks of isolation. No questions asked. Sign up and it's yours. And it's delivered to their homes. No long form or questionnaire. Certainly no means testing. Just fresh produce to folks that needed it ASAP. And that's how we work. We leverage our resources, our experience and capacity to support initiatives in the community. After all, we need to, for us, it's about making sure that folks on the front lines of the revolution that we need, that they have the fuel that they need to keep on going. I'm proud of the work that my colleagues and I have done together. I think we're pushing boundaries, we're pushing for systemic change, we're fighting for justice. I'm inspired also and excited about the type of work and analysis that I'm seeing bubbling up in organizations and workplaces across the country. I think collectively what we're doing is we're proving that better is possible. We're demonstrating what it looks like to center racial justice, to center human rights and equity in our work and how we do our work. And certainly it's not easy. And there are those that are going to push back and I've had this certainly, those that are going to push back and say challenging systemic oppression and white privilege shouldn't be our work. They'll say that we don't have funding for that, or it'll cause the organization or the sector to fracture. I'll be honest and say what I think those folks are really worried about is that they will lose their gains, and that those of us that have been seen as tokens for far too long are going to be demanding the space, the respect, and opportunities to lead that we deserve. A little story of how, when I was reminded of this. I was reminded of this at a meeting in kind of the community food movement about 8 months ago or so, when an older white man suggested that addressing racism in our food movement shouldn't be our priority, and in fact argued that it wasn't our issue, but instead an issue for the United States. So I thought, okay, who's going to jump in? I waited for someone, I waited for an ally, a bunch of self-described allies in the room. I waited for anyone in that meeting to stand up. But you know what happened? No, the room was silent. He instead suggested that what we need to focus on was fighting the threat that is climate change. Well, of course we need to focus on fighting the threat that is climate change. Without a doubt, unequivocally, it is one of the most significant threat of our time. But what he didn't realize is movements around preserving the earth, much like food, have been largely led by white folks and have not been centered around people that look like me and other BIPOC folk, the very people who will be most affected by the impacts of the climate emergency before us. So for those, I often say, that aren't on the receiving end of blatant racism, as well as systemic forms of racism every day, and have the luxury of ignoring it, you need to pay careful attention to those that are saying that the time for change has come, because we won't settle for anything less, and quite frankly, neither should you. Let's collectively fight fiercely for the world that we all know is possible. Thank you so much.